I have two examples, one from another scholar that deals with slavery in St. Lucia. For those of you who came to that destination talk, I previewed that a little bit, and I'm going to walk through some of her research. And then another one comes from my own research. I found a really great kind of tidbit that deals with some of the other things that we've dealt with. And so I'll actually walk through a lot about going to archives, working with archival material, and then how that's translated into kind of an argumentative text. As always, I'm John Moore. I have a PhD in history at Tulane, done archival research around the world, and I'll walk through that a little bit today. I'm an instructor at Loyola University in New Orleans, and occasionally next door at Tulane, and I own and operate Broad Street Cider Mead in New Orleans with my lovely wife, Diana. So I wanted, of course, to chat a little bit about the archival research to get you an idea of my background and how I operate. So in grad school, anyone have a Piles Higher and Deeper, PhDs, or married to one, or? Oh yeah, what in? Agriculture, cool. What, law, okay, yeah. So, talk to their loved ones at the time. If they're still around, then that's saying something, right? So it's a stressful process, generally, depending on 3 to 6 years, sometimes 8, depending on the degree. In history, we do about 2 years of schoolwork, 1 year of, or at least my program, teaching or kind of assistant work sometimes, and then 1 year of archival research. Generally speaking, most historian PhD candidates, so you don't have it until the end, will maybe park themselves at one archive or a couple archives and sit there and do their work slowly but surely. I, however, am not that person. So Diana and I took the opportunity. She was in between jobs conveniently, so she was able to be my research assistant, and you'll see that later on. So we took a 10-month tour around the world, which when you do this in your mid-20s, it ruins you for life, because you're just like, all right, let's keep it going. That's not how math works, unfortunately. But we took a 10-month tour around the world. We went to the UK for about 4 or 5 weeks. Wildly expensive. Also, the other thing about being a grad student is so I was fully funded, luckily, so I didn't pay for my education, and they gave me a stipend, which is about 25 grand 15 years ago in New Orleans. Actually went a long way. It doesn't anymore, unfortunately, but about a month in the UK, and then we went to Croatia for a month, Budapest for a month, somewhere cheaper, and so we took pictures, and I essentially went elsewhere to process those things. So we would go in, order a bunch of documents, and just go crazy. So and I'll walk through some of my research again, but then moved around. We were initially going to go to Kenya, actually, but that was when the terror attack there was a mall essentially that got taken over, remember, 2013? We're in crazy times now, but it's always been crazy times, says the historian. But so instead we shifted and ended up going to Malaysia for a month. So did some archive work there, and I can talk about that in the Q&A at the end. Hong Kong, Singapore, and then always wanted to go to Australia and New Zealand, because my research was, there was a program where they're putting all of the candidates for working as a district officer, so people kind of the representative of the British Empire out in the middle of Kenya or Nigeria, wherever, wanted to train them all for a year and then kind of pop them out all at once. So before I was very scattershot, so I was interested in administration, in training, and bureaucracy. I've touched on that before, but that was the kind of narrative arc of that archival research. So we went to 7 or 8 different countries and about 30 or 40 different archives. It was nuts. And so I essentially did all of the archival work that I would ever have to do if I just stuck as a historian kind of tenure track. If I went that way, I didn't, and I can riff on that later if you want. So I wanted to just nuts and bolts. This is really the only slide that'll be this way, so if you're excited, I'm sorry, but I don't think you will be. But primary sources versus secondary sources, just to give you a basic overview. Primary sources are the building blocks of historical research. They're documents, artifacts, here's a nice list, diaries, letters, photographs, government records is what I use a lot of. Artifacts, speeches, autobiographies can be that way. Art can fall into this. So closest to the topic of investigation that you'll use is evidence to support an interpretation of the past. Really, anything can be a primary source if it can be interpreted as valid evidence to illuminate a historical question. So it's really, everything can be a primary source, it's just, can they be used to build an argument or kind of tell a story? Primary sources are generally created in the time and place which is being studied, so like correspondence, diaries, newspapers, art, but they can also be produced later by eyewitnesses or participants. So memoirs and oral histories would fall into this category. If anything can be a primary source, then the main question for historians is, what is this primary source evidence of? Or what story can I tell with it? What arguments can I make with it? Comparatively, secondary sources are narratives, interpretations, and critical analysis of the past, written by historians or others, and hopefully based on primary sources. They're created by writers who have some amount of distance in time to put past events and people into a broader historical context, right? Our kind of 24-hour news cycle, there always wants to be commentary of what's going on. There's generally not historians floating about because we're a little long-winded for one. We don't do the 8 seconds very well. And oftentimes we're very hesitant to say anything about the current process unless it's something related. So when we get to Puerto Rico, that destination talk, I'll talk a little bit about the situation in the Caribbean, but not too deeply. So secondary sources build upon and interpret primary sources and generally respond to and debate with other secondary sources created by others. And I'll show you a great example of that. Secondary sources also come in a variety of formats, but generally something like peer-reviewed books and journal articles. So that's essentially thinking of it as like a high council. You do your research, submit it to others in your field. They say, yes, this is good, this is valid, you're not going out on a limb or trying to say anything too crazy. Or they'll say, make these slight changes, add these other scholars that you haven't dealt with, because it will actually help your arguments, and send it back. It's called a revise and respond. And secondary sources, so it's presentations at conferences, professional blog posts, or magazine articles. This talk I'm giving today, in some ways, is a little bit of a secondary source, so if you want to think of it that way. But it's also a primary source. Say someone wants to talk about how cruise presentations are dealt with in 50 years, right? They come upon this video, look at this random guy, and can kind of go back and look how the lighting is. Some scholars of fashion, wouldn't call myself fashion, oh, this is a nice Italian jacket. Scholars of fashion could use that and actually look back and say like, oh, this is how people dressed and presented themselves on vacations, right? So it's that you can use sources in so many different ways. So I have kind of a funny email exchange. So a lot of other things about being a historian is deferring to experts and asking for help. So we generally kind of write in a cave by ourselves. Some fields are very collaborative, the businesses, the sciences, the maths. Historians, anthropologists, kind of the humanities were generally those people that it's like, oh, find a cave and put them in there with a typewriter and they'll be fine. However, if we get out on a limb, and for me in particular, I was fairly familiar with the Caribbean, but I had that thread of the slave documents that I wanted to kind of pull on, and the limits to research are I didn't have the original documents, and the screenshot, if you're here for St. Lucia, is this very like dodgy black and white. I forgot to add it in here, or I didn't want to because it took up time, and so I wanted to see if I could get the originals. So I said, hello, Dr. Murphy, and I'll walk through who she is. I have a favor to ask, along with being an adjunct professor, so very deferential, right? I'm a presenter on fancy cruise ships. Here we go. Going to St. Lucia on a stop, came upon your research, try to pepper in academic information, and I need a little bit of help putting together slides. So kind of I'll walk through how she's doing it. And my university doesn't subscribe to Ancestry. So a lot of what we can do and can't do as scholars actually is, Ancestry. So someone asked me about if I'm interested in my own personal past, and not so much yet, maybe if I get older, but Ancestry.com is actually a pretty good research source for researching your own past, and then even the past of others. So her information was actually put on Ancestry.com because there are these records of slaves that people can build kind of a family tree by, and I'll show you how she does that for other people. I'm not going to Kew. I'll talk about what that is, but Kew is the National Archives in the UK. Also, you might have heard of Kew Gardens. Has anyone been to Kew Gardens? Yeah, it's an awesome place. Yeah, so it's the same train station. If you see people that are excited and like, I'm gonna look at plants, that's Kew Gardens. If you see people like, that's the history people. No, we're not that bad. But it is kind of a drab building. Good food though, actually. The menu changes every day. It's kind of a good tiki masala. But and then I've added over here, if there's anything else you'd like me to add to my presentation, feel free to let me know. Tessa, lovely. So same, pretty much she got her PhD, University of Chicago, 2016. I got Tulane, she's got one up on me already. She's an assistant professor, or associate professor. So assistant is you're on your tenure track. Associate, you have tenure. So in history, you've written your first book, is generally the kind of flag post, maybe about 5 to 7 years into your job. And then full professor or just professor would be the highest. And then emeritus is retired, so you retire at full professor. Associate professor, lots of grants and awards, Mellon Foundation, National Endowment for the Humanities. I had some internal awards. I'm technically a good historian. I'm not a great historian. She's one of the better ones. However, if you just kind of read through this email, it's great. She said, Dear John, so this is, and it's a little bit of call and respond. I said, Dr. Murphy, and I ended in John. She said, John, and then Tessa. It's kind of respectful. So if I got back to her, I said, hi, Tessa, thank you so much. So we differ as much as we want. So late, she's got 300 students. I have never had 300 students at once, so party. So she had a whole bunch of things on me. I think my max was 60. I teach at very small colleges, even though Syracuse is also. But attaching some of the scans, and so we'll walk through those. She gave me the point about it being in French. I've read her work, but she definitely wanted me to convey that to you, and I'll do that again. And then attaching a photo of the cover, which is a great wrinkle that I'll show you how some of these are binded. We don't always take pictures of the outside of things because it's not necessarily telling us about anything, but I'll show you that. And then gives me some color commentary. Hope it's helpful and enjoy the cruise. So I talked about this when we were talking about St. Lucia. This is essentially the British colonial main office sent out this form and said, we want to count out the amount of slaves. This is roughly 1815. So each planter representative had to report name, surname, color, which was up to interpretation, employment, age, stature, country, marks, and relations of every enslaved person over who they claimed ownership. So again, most everything was sent back in English, but because St. Lucia had this kind of English-French, English-French, English-French history, they said, French is good enough, that's fine. We're just counting stuff, we'll figure it out. And so Tessa looked at one particular estate called the Morne Citron Estate, which is a part of the island, and kind of walk through. This is an example of her scholarship. Shows she sat there, so these are two photos that I've kind of tried to smash together to you. So limits of physically what we can do as historians. So some places, this is Kew, I believe, maybe, but National Archives, there's very fundamental things about taking archival photos like this. Are photos allowed or not? So there's some archives that say you can introduce yourself, let us know who you are, why you want to see and touch our documents. We'll maybe interview you and ask for your references, but you cannot take photographs. So if you want to take notes, that's fine. Here's a pencil without an eraser. It's very much, and no pens. Like if you get a pen, you can curse, you can bleed on the floor, and they'll be like, that's fine. If there's like a pen involved, archivists will come out of the woodwork and slide tackle you. So it's very much keen on their documents. So archivists, want to make sure to preserve their documents, and they see themselves as custodians because this is a one-off. This now exists digitally, and I have a copy, but otherwise the original is probably a one-off, and it doesn't exist anymore. So how the documents are kept and preserved, archivists are very concerned about. So this is one of the forms. It's in French, and so it has those different columns, it matters who's writing it, so color is a very good one. She has a whole section on how different planters would use completely different words to describe someone's color. Some of them are in relation to their other slaves, some of them were absolutes, some of them they just said black, mulatto, like it wasn't super descriptive. So then she had undergrad students, excuse me. She had 3 or 4 over the time and AI can probably do this now, but some universities, especially private and public, does this too. They want their students to do certain work, and there's a certain amount of, even if they're getting paid or not, they at least get to help with a scholarship, and there is pride in that work. And so she had undergrad students transcribe and add everything to a database so that she could run some amount of analysis. It's not anything too crazy, but mostly kind of seeing the different types of jobs, seeing different types of descriptors that are used for these individuals. Here's another source, and she referenced it in her email, and I'll tell you about it again. So it's the photo of the cover and image from the index. So these are from a registry of what was known as personal slaves, or people enslaved outside of plantation contexts. So maybe the owner lives in a city or is a specialist like a carpenter, so they're more likely to be laboring households, hired out, or performing skilled work like masonry, sailing, etc. So the outside of this is one thing that she took a picture of, which again, we don't always. But thinking about limits to our work, you have to think, is this a binded book? Did it have a binder and it has subsequently broken over the years? And so perhaps when she first got this, Diana and I have seen this, where there will be essentially a cloth binder. Rubber bands degrade over time, so thinking about certain materials to hold things together. Maybe this is in its own whole bag altogether. So how materials are kept and preserved and presented to us as historians also impacts the work that we can do. So opening it up, we can actually see, so it is binded and it's still binded together. And so what will happen is some places, it looks like that's what's happening here, they'll essentially give you, it's like Legos, but soft padding, where you will lay a book on it so it's not breaking the binder. So that's the biggest thing when reading archival books, so that you can maybe open it a little bit. And again, limiting the amount. So another thing archivists never want you to do is like, oh, let me look it up like this. Like, no, keep it on the table, keep it on the table, everyone. So it's slowly but surely moving back and forth. And so taking pictures, she again did kind of a picture on this side, picture on this side, and then I've put them together for you. So this is showing kind of list of names, and I think this was either, it's probably age, current age. No, there's 106 over here. So I'm not exactly sure of the context, but another type of source that Tessa was using. So then you might say, John, how do historians actually use these things? So this is an example of hers. So it's a scholarly article. William and Mary is a very well-regarded journal, generally of slavery and the slave trade, generally of the southern United States, but the Caribbean also kind of makes sense for her to present her research there. You want to give your research to other scholars that are roughly in your field and kind of know what's going on. And so how she's walking through, and we're not going to read all of this, I'm just going to point out three main parts of a secondary source that's well done. So what Tessa is giving a hook. So up here, 30 years of your life, talking about Marguerite Grande survived second middle passage, things that she knows, things that she can surmise through all the documents. And then by 1815 at age 75, deemed too old to labor on the field gang, but her daughter was still working in the coffee grove, et cetera, et cetera. There's this whole, oh, how do you know all this? How did you actually glean all this information? We can't transport ourselves back 200 years and be like, hey, how's your life? Like, how is it actually working, all of these things? And when it comes to individuals like the enslaved, poor people, women, a lot of people don't have time to sit there and think about their daily life, and even us, right? We think, oh, we have plenty of time. You're probably not sitting there documenting how and looking back how you felt about the world 10 years ago or 20 years ago. Some of you are, that's great, but a lot of us aren't. So how do historians recreate that? And that's what Tessa's doing here. Giving a hook. Historiography is another one, and this is a very kind of garbly word that historians do, but this is that when I talked about secondary sources in relation to other secondary sources. So it's essentially saying other historians have talked about, where does she have hers? Over here. So works that make excellent use of such sources include Williams, Dunn, Berry, Hunter, et cetera, et cetera. It's name checking, but in a very positive way. It's not your friend who says, oh, I went to dinner with this restaurateur and this restaurateur, and just kind of bragging to you. It's a little bit of that. It's more, I, as a scholar, understand what has already come before. I'm utilizing it in my own research, and I'm either thinking of it as a brick wall. I'm either building a new brick, or I'm saying we need to reorganize some of these existing bricks, how we think about this question. Or very rarely, we'll need to remove these bricks. That's more like kind of, if you get stuff from the pre-1950s that has kind of issues of race, sex, class that need to be really, really rethought. But generally speaking, it is this idea of positioning yourself amongst the works of others. And then background is the other one. So it's essentially, so she has this hook, and then again, kind of walks through, how do we deal with the enslaved? How do we deal, she's dealing with St. Lucia, how other scholars dealt with that. It's a fairly peripheral island versus somewhere like Jamaica. A lot bigger, a lot more research, so that makes sense. Other things, and I showed this the other day, using primary sources, she was able to build a family tree and kind of walk through a narrative arc. And this is a great way to actually show these are all enslaved. They probably couldn't write maybe could read if oftentimes going to church was one way, so reading hymns, going through that process was one. But generally speaking, these people otherwise not totally lost to history, but Tessa is building a little bit of a background and knowledge for us to know. So I want, as always, and this is a little bit more of a specialty talk, right? So person to the left, person to the right, take about 60 to 90 seconds. What do you know about the work of historians before this talk? Do you know anything about how slavery is researched and presented? And then any questions so far that I've talked about. So kind of chat with those around you, behind, whatever, and then we'll come together as a group. So please, one and then two up front here, and then I'll get you started. Please.
All right, so Tessa opened her article with an anecdote about Marguerite Grande. And the question for me about historians is, how do they choose which anecdote to use versus empirical evidence? And do they always know that the anecdotal evidence that they're presenting, the story they're presenting, is representative of the numbers of the empirical evidence?
Yeah, so the question was, Tessa opened her article with the narrative arc, so I called it this giving this hook. And historians, I'll ad-lib a little bit, but historians generally don't use a lot of quantitative evidence, I'll say, instead. So this idea of, is this representative of what's going on? And historians would say, we don't know exactly, right? We can't go back and interview people. So I had a conversation earlier, someone was asking up front about historical fiction and how do we know if we see kind of representations of things like even well-known people, the Crown, for example, the kind of narrative like, oh, what's happening behind the scenes and making it a little bit of a drama. We all understand, although they have to have the disclaimer even on that show, like, we're not exactly sure any of this happened. And that's very wealthy, very famous, very well-known people. And so historians would essentially say, trying to do our best and just telling a story. And she essentially is picking Marguerite Grande, and she walks through her later on in her article, in that she happened to work on a plantation where the records are saved. We don't really know. There might be other plantations where the records haven't made it to our current era. So a lot of the archival research bit is a bit of luck. And then it just happened that she had a good amount of children that survived, and then her children's children, so she built out this family tree and kind of walked around this. She was able to pull a lot of threads together. So it worked as a narrative flow, so it's part of it. So I got one up here and then one over here.
But in doing the research, fact versus opinion, personal biases that we all have about certain issues, how they're presented and how you can separate fact from nonsense.
Yeah, so this idea of fact versus fiction, personal bias, and kind of nonsense out there. And so historians, instead of bias and saying this idea, oh, I can get above bias, I know facts, I have cleared my mind of all the things that's known before, we use a word called positionality. It's another annoying one. So positionality would be to say, for myself, I was born in California, I'm phenotypically white male, currently 41 years old. I can't overcome any of these things, right? I can't say, I'm going to pretend that I am an 1815s enslaved person or even plantation owner. We can't do that, and as historians, and we'll admit that. This idea of primary documents and secondary documents, this is why we do our best. So when she is walking through and using these secondary sources, I have a more explicit example of using a primary document and then other types of sources to give it. You are building an argument and building. You're saying that there's limits to the scholarship, there's limits to our own knowledge. Are you doing your best? It's this idea of building it brick by brick, and sometimes the whole wall has to go away, and that's okay too. But there is, I'm not a postmodernist, there is truth, I think, but there's a whole strand of thought that says it's all relative. That's a whole different wrinkle. But we do our best, is what I would say. And then I'll end over here, and then I'll have to move on. Yeah.
I'm also more interested as well is how did it survive that long?
Yeah.
Right, and then is it parchment that is what it's written on and vellum on the outside?
Yeah, thank you. So the question was, how did it survive, the actual documents? So luck has to do with it. It matters, so generally the tropics are hard places. We talked about elegant dilapidation in one of these talks. Same idea for documents, right? Leave a book out in, I don't know, we'll say, leave a book out in Wyoming, outside for a week or two, come back, it might be a little dusty, it might be a little whatever. Leave a book outside in New Orleans in July, knowing laughter, and it's a completely different, the book will absorb humidity, so it's very particular, the level of humidity, the type of paper it's on, the type of boxes. So when I was talking about the binding, how do you actually store this? Is it stacked? Archivists generally stack things like vinyl, so kind of up and down, so it's not taking a lot of weight, its own weight. It's done the other way, whatever's on the bottom of the box will get kind of pressed down over time. So all of these things are things that archivists are very concerned with and historians are respectful of and understand. But a lot of it is also luck. There are times where governments might say, oh, we don't want to release these documents, as the censorship side, pros and cons, but then also there might be a fire or a flood, or so Tulane kind of famously or infamously had most of their microfiche stored in their basement when Katrina hits, and so lost whole reams of information. So it does also come down to luck. To circle back to the first question, why would she pick this one kind of person in a narrative? Sometimes it's just haphazard, and that's what the documents lead to. So I'm gonna run through my own work real quick. And then, so behind the scenes organization is a key for historians. Most of us who are not organized didn't get through the process or kind of forced ourselves to become so. I, instead of being very creative, I'm just very organized. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in the alcohol stuff. But this was my main file. So you can see it. So dissertation, I had kind of a sub-witchcraft process. Where it was in Britain, Hong Kong, Transvaal. CO is Colonial Office. So Tessa's documents were from the Treasury Department, so T. So that again is kind of this bureaucratic expertise as far as how governmental archives operate are very different than private archives. So, and I'll give one example. There's Diana, 2014. Again, we travel around the world. And I'm not sure what it's all, but Hong Kong Public Records Bureau. So outside the Diana, the research assistant, she was great to have around. Still is great. So I'm kind of a hot mess without her, but I'm mostly operated. It's fine. So archives are either these big formal government buildings. They can be very small things. They can be informal things, right? My friend who's helped me kind of set up for these talks, he's done these talks for about 18 years now, and he says that he has a legal box filled with the daily events, so we call them currents here, I think, from every cruise he's ever taken on. So he has his own personal archive, and a lot of you probably have your own personal archives. Some of them are well maintained and well organized, others are not necessarily. Nixon papers are notorious, real quick, that when Nixon donated his archive, it looks like that someone just took their arm like this and then shoved it into trash bags and then said, here, take them. So an archivist had to sit there and organize it. And how archivists organize things, they try not to be very controversial, so they try to find a logic, but government sources here. For example, this is, yeah, I got it. This is the employment of officers in the Colonial Office of Jewish Origin. So we talked about some amount of Jewish history, so this is 1924. Stated it's the Palestine is still under the mandate system, so the British are kind of running it. And so what I was interested in was people getting recruited for colonial service, and part of that thread was going out to universities around the Dominions, so Canada, South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia at the time, and working with universities there and saying, can you find us good candidates that would work in the colonial services? We want to essentially expand this idea of who can work here. And so these little notes here are my notes that I walk through. So the characters involved, Ralph First is kind of one of those guys that hung around way too long. He had the same job, would find different bosses. We all know some of those people, right? So First was one of my main characters. Fidian over here was kind of worked in the colonial office and the head office, and then there's other characters like the governor of Mauritius comes in here. So essentially this is the University of Toronto, the recruiting officer said, hey, I have a candidate here that'd be great temperament, standard white guy, of course, is what they're looking for, but he's Jewish. Should I say that he might be a good fit or not? I'm not sure. And this is classic bureaucracy in action. There's about 8 different people going back and forth. We don't think he's an issue. Of course, a British subject. We have to remember modern forms of identification is really a post-World War II thing. This idea of, oh, everyone had a passport. Not really. It was kind of, you had to be vouched for. And so walking through, I'm translating a little bit. They're crossing off, and that's everyone who's read the thing. They're just kind of check marking themselves off, like saying, I'm okay, I don't need to weigh in. So no objection in Palestine, but probably prefer not to remain. For Iraq was also part of the mandate system. But we don't really need to say anything about it unless someone asks. Classic bureaucracy in action. So finally, after all of this work, back and forth, they write a 1-page memo. Thanks for asking. Should work out as long as they're, but I should feel justified in adding that in such a case, questions of personality, tact, and manners might be regarded of particular importance. So this very wink of like, they better be a good one if they're going to be of Jewish origin was the most controversial thing. But how did I use this? All this hard work, and also, if you notice, that's Dana's thumb. So we can't, matters on the paper. Sometimes you have to wear gloves. Sometimes you they don't want you to wear gloves because you lose tactile ability. You actually end up ripping more papers if you have gloves because you can't feel the difference between the two. But all of this hard work, 300 pages of dissertation, 300 pages of dissertation, I'll read it for you. So I'm talking about this idea of who is British in their minds and these bureaucrats. So British is malleable. Potential Jewish recruits, for example, were permissible to all those who dismissed. There was someone who was Polish, and they called him a Polish alien. And in this case, because there was no Jewish state at the time, as there was with Poland at the time, 1920s. So again, although some colonies might have had some issues with these hires, like Mauritius, with its French population, there's this constant, the British think they're better than the French because of whatever. But this idea that French people were anti-Semitic was a common thing in the 1920s, or Middle Eastern mandates. As long as someone of Jewish origin was a British subject, he was acceptable. Again, these staffers didn't want to make a public statement of this policy. The exception for Jewish hires was Palestine. The staffers did not wish to anger Palestinians, who were the main group that filled local positions. They preferred proper British, i.e. non-Jewish recruits. One administrator even had to swap his upcoming posting from Cyprus to Palestine because a Jewish administrator changed his name in order to try to get around the policy and be posted to Palestine. So what I'm doing here, so this is the document, so I cite that. Getting back to this, how do we know what's true? How do we present information? This is a different CO kind of related, so 877. So one would be the different box, so it's kind of a couple boxes down. And then also some other COs, and then this is some work that I've found on the Jewish Virtual Library, and then this is a secondary source that I added to back up. All of this work, about a half a paragraph, 300 pages of an entire thing. So that's how kind of historians are walking through and how we use research. So going from, again, this organization piece, so organizing, so we go to archives first, of course. I'm big on organizing and researching that way, walking through actual documents, some people doing their notes while they're sitting in an archive. I'd rather be on a beach, and after this we went to Khao Phangan in Thailand, it was great, and do the work, and then write up in a hammock in Audubon Park is where I wrote all of my dissertation. There was no Wi-Fi back then, and like I didn't have, so I was gonna be on the internet, rode my bike, did it for 90 minutes, wrote just for 90 minutes, and then went home. Thought about it, and then that's it. Got through it before everyone else in my program did, actually. So and they were like, you have 6 years of funding. I was like, I'm gonna do this in 6 years. So that is really it. I don't have enough time, unfortunately, for what an archive is and does. I walked through there. Has anyone been to an archive? I have enough for hands. What kind of archive?
University of Illinois grad stacks.
Oh, cool. Okay, University of Illinois, over here. You've been to the DC archive and seen all of that? Yeah. DC as well.
Almost next door to the Delaware State.
Oh, Delaware State Archives. So yeah, official archives. And then smaller archives will also have some information and a lot of good programming too. They're not exactly libraries, like I was saying, but sometimes they'll actually have some great stuff. So now universities might come out with some great like presentations of articles, or excuse me, documents like I was doing here. So I always like to end. Thank you very much for giving me your your attention. It is one of the rarest things we have in this world. And if you see Diana and I walking around, feel free to say hello. So thank you again so much.